All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to another episode of Culture Calls Dialing into the Future, where we discuss everything on culture. Today, we are in conversation with Hári Sewell. Hári is a writer and speaker in his specialist area of social justice, equality, race, and culture in mental health. Hári is an honorary senior visiting fellow at the University of Central Lancashire and special guest lecturer at the University of Bradford. He's a visiting lecturer at Christ Church, Canterbury University, and is a member of the scientific board of the ESRC Centre for Society and Mental Health. Hári is a proud member of the council at the British Association for Social Workers. An absolute delight to have you on our show, Hári. How are you feeling today?
Yeah, good. Thank you very much, Jeff. Thanks. It's an honor to be part of the show. Thank you for the invitation. Looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Before we even get into, all the questions that I do have lined up for you, can you tell us, the audience, a bit about yourself and what you're currently pursuing?
Yeah, sure. So my background is in social work, and it's kind of very foundational to what I do. I, in my first role as a social worker, had a split role, which was partly community development, working with the African Caribbean, the Black community in a particular part of the United Kingdom, as well as just kind of being a social worker and a community mental health team, carrying a diverse range of cases. And it's foundational because it meant right from the beginning of my career in the sector, I had an orientation which was around seeing people as located in contexts, not just as individuals with a presenting problem. And that's just informed my work. So, over the years, I've worked in the sector largely in strategic managerial roles, though I have done some operational management. And alongside that, developed an interest based on that first role I described, working with the Black community, developed this interest in the causes for the inequalities that seem to be so persistent and still remain so in mental health, but in other aspects of our social world, and began to read and research, and eventually began to write and be published in that field. So largely now I'm seen as someone who offers a critique, not just of the inequalities based on racialized identities in mental health, but also in the workforce and in society more generally. So that's largely what I do. So for the last 14 years, I have been working independently, pursuing those interests, supporting organizations, with my tagline really of seeking to disrupt those things that we, I guess, imbibe and assume in an uncritical way. I try and create critical thinking and raising critical consciousness, as Paulo Freire in Pedagogy of the Oppressed would describe it. That's my work, to disrupt with gentleness, though.
That is fantastic. And all I can see right now is your immense work and diversity in the amount of fields that you work in, and the amount of clients, and the amount of topics that you've handled. And I think doubling down on that thing itself, you have seen a lot of work culture, in different environments and in different companies. So how do you see work culture evolving, especially in this hybrid and remote work culture, which is, probably looking to stay for a while right now? How do you see work culture evolving in this environment?
Yeah, well, I guess the culture in organizations to a large extent reflects the cultures in our societies, and there is a dominant culture in the global society, which still tends towards hierarchical methods of decision making and setting the cultures in organizations, and more consensual approaches are, I guess, attempted in individual settings, but are often difficult to pursue, largely because we kind of operate within regulatory systems, and rightly so. So, we have a regulator for the system that, holds individual providers and commissioners of services to account, set standards and ensure that those standards are being attained as far as possible. So the culture still is that dominant one of, okay, we've got these accountability measures we need to meet. And once you have that in place, there will be the constant pursuing of the criteria. That means you will meet the standards. It's kind of understandable. So the things that are given priority in that context are then going to be reflected in what's given priority in the organization. So if the regulator emphasizes financial management and strong leadership, then of course an organization will invest in good financial management and leadership. So the culture as it's evolving is still pretty, in my view, rigidly fixed in that command and control approach. I name that because my critique of that comes from the kind of writings of feminists who will say what we're actually seeing is the replication of approaches that we might see in the military, and other institutions that rely on a command and control structure. And either explicitly or implicitly, we absorb those approaches into our systems. And though we try and operate loosely with them, they still leave their imprint. So I'm interested in indigenous knowledges and kind of feminist perspectives that would say, or perhaps there are other ways of accessing the talents and the ways in which people think creatively. So that's it really. The cultures are evolving to be more consensual, but I think that that rod of rigidity around command and control is still there. And what the pandemic has done with the flexible working has imposed upon us a rethink, which is now creating an opportunity for more diverse voices to be heard in the debate about what works in an organization. So the idea that you turn up and you're partly measured on being present as opposed to your output, that's shifting quite rapidly. And that increased flexibility where people don't have to be seen at their desk between 9 to 5 means that if people are working at home and they can actually put their laundry out to dry on the line rather than using their electricity to run a tumble dryer or wherever it is, then people are now affording themselves that opportunity to blend home and work life. If it's really, really sunny and you live near to the beach and you think, well, actually, I could kind of just go out and have a lunchtime swim at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when it's hot, rather than going down at 5:30 before you go to work or getting back at sunset. It's these kind of freedoms mean that people's relationship with work is changing because it's now possible to blend work and your social life or your personal life more effectively for some. And I have to underscore it that there is a degree of elitism, largely those people who undertake roles that enable them to work at home and aren't fixed in locations. There are particular jobs that lend themselves to that, and it does create a separation.
Right, and I completely agree with how the flexibility gives not only the company but also the people working there the freedom to choose how exactly they can work. And I think it's also doubling down on the advent of how technology has grown in all these times, and how technology is helping build that flexibility. So I think my next question would be something very similar. So do you think data and technology play a key role in determining organizational culture? Because we just spoke about how the advent of technology and the price of freedom is also available everywhere. So do you think data and technology play a key role both for an employee and an employer in determining organizational culture?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I have to preface, I will answer that question, but I have to preface it again with a broader critique. Of course, one of the consequences is that tech organizations have made a huge fortune out of the pandemic because of course we need better technology. I had old computers that couldn't manage to host Teams and Zoom on the same device and to be working effectively. I had dropouts, so I had to buy more kit. I can see people with headsets. People have got many more devices, and there's a consequence because there's a cost to the environment. In using things like cobalt mining from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and kind of consequences around our trading laws that create further inequalities. Whilst the tech companies might be becoming wealthier, these countries aren't really thriving off this. So there is that critique. People often think our data's in the cloud, but of course there are physical places where we're kind of storing this data. And again, that has a cost in the environment too. So there are consequences. It isn't just something to be celebrated. But one of the things that is afforded by teleworking is this ability to interact in a broader way and to include more diverse voices from around the world. So we can get Indigenous people involved in conferences in the UK by sending a link, and if we're paying someone a fee, pay the fee and they're there. We don't have the hotel costs and the flight costs and the impact on the environment, but we can be more inclusive of these diverse voices. And I'm seeing that in my work, and I think that's something to be celebrated, definitely. So it creates inclusivity. And again, if people want early meetings, and there might be parents or guardians of children, or even other carers who are trying to work around school, it's possible maybe to get onto a meeting online a lot sooner than kind of doing the school run, or going and doing a caring visit to an older relative and getting back to an office. So it's kind of allowing a bit more flexibility around that. So in terms of harvesting data, there is the intellectual knowledge that is distributed. I keep coming back to this notion that even though we think that the elite in an organization have the power for decision making, actually the people that really inform sound decisions are those people either in the community and the workforce with this dispersed knowledge, but are closer to the issues that are surfacing. And the more we can access that knowledge, the richer the decision making will be. In my work specifically now, as an example, thinking about the experience of minoritized people in the workforce, that ability to have several meetings online, maybe in different locations, if there's an organization that has a large footprint, maybe offices, the estate might be dispersed across a geographical location. It means I could meet with different regions or different sites all in the same day. I could even have 4 meetings in the same day online, whereas if I had to go different places across the same county to arrive, set up and host meetings, at best I could achieve 2. Often it would just be kind of going to one location and then that would be the day. So it means we can kind of gather more of that intelligence, which then becomes data. And I guess a lot of what I've just been, and this is my last point on it, that I'm trying to underscore is that whilst we think of tech as driving this, as I said before, there's a physical place where this data is held. There is an embodied force behind the data that people at some point are going to be shaping, informing, harvesting the data. And I kind of think it's really helpful for us to keep that balance of awareness that the tech is a useful part of it, but actually people are still driving that. The intelligence is coming from us, even creating algorithms that we use. Someone has to do that, creation of the technology to enable the algorithms to be captured. So that's what I celebrate in my work, is the human side of it. But yeah, obviously there's a lot of data, and we're becoming more sophisticated at understanding things, for example, around workforce patterns in promotions, in disciplinary action, or even indicators of other cultures about who gains access to training and learning and development opportunities within an organization compared with those who don't. And we're capturing data like that through staff surveys and workforce surveys. So yeah, again, that's an example of where we're harvesting data, and then we can kind of have a supposedly empirical look at patterns in the workforce to inform our strategies going forwards.
I absolutely, was able to take a few points which I didn't know would make sense. We always speak about technology from the user end, but we never fail to realize that what we use is there's a lot of work that goes behind it, and especially the where the point where you told that it's all there on the cloud, but there are physical servers who are actually handling that, and that needs people to be built on. And I absolutely agree to that. And I'm just taking a pivot here at understanding a lot more about your career. You've worked a lot in building diversity, equity, and inclusion as a practice in a lot of organizations. So I want to understand, what, according to you, does a truly diverse organization mean? What comprises of a truly diverse organization? Because I see that a lot of people are, jumping on the bandwagon and not really understanding what exactly it means, and they're all trying to get into it. But what truly does a diverse organization mean?
Okay, great. So a lot of organizations now are speaking the language of belonging. Do people actually feel as though they belong, which is linked to the inclusion part of either diversity, equality, and inclusion, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. They all kind of try and capture the same thing. Simply put, it is possible to have an organization that is diverse, significantly diverse, and you could have everyone who has a manager in their title out of 1,000 in the workforce being white and hetero and male. So you could have every single manager looking like that, and then the other percentage might be mixed with a whole range of diversities, and you could say overall the organization is really diverse, but it wouldn't reflect diversity at all levels and inclusion, for example, in access to the systems of power and the positions where decision making really has a massive influence on the organization. So that whole banner of EDI, I think, often confuses people, because we say, yeah, we're kind of trying to achieve diversity, but diversity in and of itself isn't an end goal, for the reasons I've said. Is that there is an issue about distribution, who's where. If you've got 90% of your cleaners are from ethnically diverse backgrounds, but that's not reflected in the seniority of the organization, what it actually does, it confirms a belief in the minds of the workforce that this is the kind of work that these people do. So if there is someone of a racialized background who attempts to get a manager job, they're doing that against the background of this unconscious belief based on what people are seeing every single day, that the kind of work people who look like you do is hoovering and cleaning the toilets. And somewhere in the minds that remains, and in the studies of unconscious bias, we refer to that as the availability heuristic. That becomes people's truths, whether they realize it or not. So there is a problem. It is actually in some ways counterintuitive if achieving just diversity is actually a way of reinforcing the stereotypes about who does what kind of role. So inclusion in that goes back to my point about, well, are people included in all aspects in the seniority and decision making, and are people able to be included as themselves? Frantz Fanon in his book Black Skin, White Mask described that phenomena of people of color wearing a mask of whiteness in order to gain access to more privileged positions or acceptability in society or in an organization. And the question is, are staff from diverse backgrounds, whatever aspect of identity we're referring to, it doesn't just have to be around racialized identities, it could be a gender identity, it could be around sexual orientation, are people having to wear the mask of the dominant culture in order to feel accepted? And if so, we create the illusion of diversity, almost just the embodiment of it, but not the actuality of it, because people are literally just surrendering to the dominant culture. And that's a problem. So the key test really in organizations is to try and establish, using as many mechanisms like staff surveys, to find out from people whether or not they really feel able to come and be their true selves, and therefore to kind of contribute from that richness of diversity. And sometimes you need affinity groups to do that, groups where you've got people who feel they have an affinity with people who have a shared characteristic with them, who feel open and able to speak about things that are on their minds. So I guess a truly diverse organization is one that would do that, create spaces where people can begin to say whether or not they feel truly included and belong, and if not, what are the barriers and what needs to be done, and to harvest that information to use that to shape the culture of the organization so that people can be their true selves, as opposed to code switching and becoming consistent with some perceived dominant norm.
Right. I absolutely agree to that. And I really loved the perspective that you had to bring on what exactly does it take to become a truly diverse organization? I think a lot of companies are realizing the value that uh, having a diverse workforce and having a diverse workplace is, not only in terms of having the morality of it, but also in building the actual future that they're trying to have. So what according to you should be the first step that an employer should take, and what is your biggest advice for an employer to get started with DEI? How exactly should be step one for starting with diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I think the introduction of two frameworks, I can name specific frameworks. It doesn't need to be these two, but it relates to the two types of approaches. I know the first step should be this dovetailing of these two perspectives. One is to normalize conversations about difference. So we could use nonviolent communication as a framework to acknowledge that by definition, if you create true diversity, you will introduce grit. It seems surprising, but because people expect there to be diversity and harmony, that harmony won't evolve in and of its own accord, because the whole point about us being diverse is that we see and experience the world in different ways, and therefore there are going to be points of rub and contradiction and grit, as I call it. So rather than be surprised and respond retrospectively, there's real benefit in organizations saying, once we introduce diversity, we're bound to kind of have these, at worst, adversarial encounters, but as a minimum, there's going to be this grit. So let's plan for it and see what the oil is to kind of help smooth those things out. So having nonviolent communication as a framework means people can talk about their hurts or their different perspectives in a held way, so it doesn't just descend into adversarial positions of accusation and counter-accusation, but people can kind of have consensual conversations where the goal isn't just to correct, but to connect. You're trying to kind of create a connection, because that connection is the birthplace of possibility. So that then needs to be dovetailed with work on listening. And the second, so I mentioned nonviolent communication from Marshall Rosenberg, Otto Scharmer, a colleague in the loosest terms. He was in fact on my first podcast, Seasoning the Reasoning podcast, and we had this fantastic conversation around a lot of his work, including the 4 levels of listening, and that is for me the other thing that is really essential. Otto Scharmer's work, The Essentials of Theory U, documents the 4 levels of listening. The first level is in a way the kind of weakest level, which he refers to as downloading, where we're listening, but in our minds, we already think we kind of have a sense of what the story is going to be. So we've already kind of downloaded it. And I summarize it by saying, most of us recognize it when we're talking to people and they're nodding emphatically, and sometimes they'll finish our sentence and in our heads we're thinking, that's not actually what I was going to say. But they're downloading because they kind of already think they know. And that's not true listening. And we kind of go through 4 levels where we get to generative listening. So the kind of second one is kind of specifically listening for disconfirming information. And then you kind of, that's what Otto would say is the act of science, is that we're forever saying, all right, this is what I think, but let me just see whether or not there's anything there that might disprove my belief. And that's a real shift in how we listen. And then we kind of get to the 4th, I've jumped over the 3rd, we get to the 4th, which is generative listening. And that is where the intention of the listening is to generate something new. And it becomes a challenge to our identities, because we've been socialized, all of us, to see the world in a particular way, shaped by our family and our cultural influences. And that becomes our truth about the way the world is. And generative listening, if we're really trying to create something new from that process, means people are going to say things that we initially kind of think, oh, yeah, but I wonder whether that's a jaded view, or will that work? And, to put those aside and say, actually, let me engage with it, like from the inside of your experience. And it can be challenging, but that disruption, which is what I talk about, is again the birthplace for real transformation, because you're now thinking, well, there are parts of knowing that were outside of my reach just because of my individual experience. So generative listening along with nonviolent communication for me would be the starting point for organizations to be more transformative.
Right. I'm out of words. Thank you so much for joining us, Harry. And I was able to learn a lot today. And I think our listeners were able to learn a lot as well. And I think the first steps that you did tell for DEI should be listening and learning as to what exactly your employees want and what exactly the people want, and not just being what you want. I love that, and thank you so much for joining us. Is there any final words that you want to leave us with?
Yeah, I just would say it takes, and this is a quote, I can't attribute it, that it is uncomfortable being uncomfortable all the time. But when we become comfortable with being uncomfortable, amazing things happen.
Wow, that is fantastic. Thank you so much, Harry, for joining us. And hey, thank you all for listening until the end. And we will see you again next time. Make sure you leave a like or leave a comment and how you felt. And we will see you again next time. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.